The silver bit into Hela's wrists, like the teeth of something that would never let go, and the smell that rose from her own skin was one she already knew she would carry for the rest of her life. Not like the herbs she scorched in her mortar on cold winter mornings. Not like the accident burns she treated on younger wolves who hadn't yet learned to respect open flames. This was something else entirely. This was silver reacting with living flesh, something between charred iron and rendered fat and the raw copper weight of blood, and it rose in thin, pale curls of smoke that drifted upward toward the grey-black stone sky like incense at a funeral. Her jaw had locked so tightly she could feel the pressure in her back teeth. She breathed through her nose in slow, deliberate counts. In, 2, 3. 3 silver links, that was all they had used. 3 links around each wrist, bolted into the granite face of the cliff with iron pegs driven deep into the mountain. And Magnus's hunters had found the whole arrangement tremendously funny. Why waste good silver on a worthless omega? One of them had said, wiping his eyes. 3 links is generous. 3 links is more than she deserves. The others had laughed. Hela had said nothing. She pressed her spine against the cold rock and kept breathing. The chains had been on for perhaps 20 minutes, but already the skin beneath the silver had moved through its stages with grim efficiency. First red, then white, then that terrible mottled grey-purple she had only ever seen on the worst silver poisonings she'd treated in years of quiet, unpaid service. The flesh was splitting at the edges of each link. She could feel the silver threading into her bloodstream like slow ice, spreading upward from her wrists toward her elbows, toward her chest. Her wolf, that thin, flickering thing that had never fully surfaced in 21 years of living, was somewhere deep inside her ribcage, making a sound like a child crying in an empty room. She was 21 years old. She had been Moonfang Pack's unofficial healer for 7 of those years, mixing poultices from wild yarrow and moonleaf in the lean-to-shed behind the packhouse kitchen, because no one had offered her the actual infirmary. She had set dislocated shoulders by touch alone. She had diagnosed silver poisoning in others before the wounds turned hot. She could brew a fever-break tea in the dark from memory alone. And none of that mattered now, because she had done the one thing every survival instinct in her body had screamed against for 12 years. She had let herself be caught. It had happened exactly as she'd planned it, which did not make the pain any easier to endure. Magnus's hunters had been searching for her for 3 days. 5 of them, pack enforcers who had run with the beta for years, men with hard eyes and zero hesitation, sweeping the northern ridgeline with the kind of a coordinated patience that told Hela one thing clearly. They weren't simply angry. They were afraid because she had the journal, Luna Illyra's journal. The one Hela had found hidden behind a loose stone in the dead Luna's old chambers. The one containing names, dates, payments, and signatures. The one that detailed, in the Luna's own careful handwriting, exactly who had organized her death and why. Magnus had recognized the leather cover the moment he'd spotted it in Hela's hands. And suddenly, the Omega girl nobody had ever bothered to notice was the most dangerous creature in Moonfang territory. She could have run. She had stood at the northern border with the journal pressed against her chest and the open wilderness stretching ahead of her and thought, go, just go. Find somewhere they'll never look and live quietly and survive. That word, survive, had been her entire vocabulary since she was 9 years old. But then she had remembered what Luna Illyra had told her once, in a garden full of moonbloom flowers, in a voice low enough that no one else could hear. If anything ever happens to me, Victor will always come. He will come for the scent of my flowers, Hela. He will always know. Victor, the Alpha King. She had heard his name the way everyone in the Northern Territories heard it, in lowered voices, in pauses between sentences, in the particular silence that fell over a room whenever anyone mentioned the Blackmount campaign, or the Eastern Border incident 3 years ago when 40 armed rogues had crossed into his territory, and none of them had come back. Victor Dawnmere, last living heir of Luna Illyra's bloodline, a man whose wolf had not been seen in 18 years, not since the night his mother had supposedly fallen from these very cliffs, and who had spent those 18 years building something the Pack Elders could only call war, because war was the closest thing they understood to it. He had never returned to Moonfang. The men who had murdered his mother had counted on exactly that. They had slept peacefully in his absence. Until now, Hela's wrist screamed. She lifted her head and looked out across Blackstone Pass, at the dark ridgeline cutting against the early evening sky, at the tree line far below the cliff, motionless and black. She had spent years tending the flowers on Illyra's grave, years pressing dried moonbloom into the pages of her notebooks, Years wearing the dead lunar scent in her hair and her skin and her clothing, not because she had planned any of this, but because she had loved the woman buried beneath that stone, and grief had made her strange, and she had kept returning anyway. But now that strangeness had a purpose. Because what Hela understood, what she had understood when she stepped deliberately into the hunter's path 3 days ago and let them chase her to this cliff, was simple. Victor hadn't only inherited his mother's blood, he had inherited her senses. And somewhere beyond those mountains, behind 18 years of silence and controlled fury, and a wolf that hadn't spoken since the night everything was taken from him, something was changing. Because an Omega girl was burning, and she smelled like home. 12 years earlier, Hela had not yet learned to be afraid of Beta Magnus. She had not yet learned what men like him were truly capable of. She had only known the garden, and the flowers, and the woman who had let a lonely, unwanted Omega child sit beside her in the soil and ask questions no one else had ever bothered to answer. Before we begin, let's give a special welcome to our newest channel member, Amy Johnson. Thank you for joining and supporting the channel. It's wonderful to have you with us. If you'd like to support the channel and enjoy member-exclusive benefits, just hit the join button and become a member today. We'd love to welcome you next. The silver had reached her elbows. Hela could tell by the particular quality of the cold. Not the cold of wind or stone, but the cold of something spreading inward, threading through muscle and vein with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. Her vision had developed edges. The grey granite behind her brightened and dimmed with each heartbeat. The hunters had stopped laughing. Not out of mercy. They had simply grown bored. 2 of them sat on the rocks further up the path playing cards with a deck so worn the suits were barely distinguishable. A third stood with his back to her, watching the valley below, one hand resting on the crossbow at his belt. Magnus stood apart from the others, closer to the cliff's edge, his broad shoulders turned outward toward the pass. He hadn't looked at her in 20 minutes. He didn't need to. The silver would finish it. Hela pulled a slow breath through her teeth and focused on the horizon. The sun had dropped behind the western ridge, and the sky above Blackstone Pass had gone the color of a bruise, deep violet at the edges, paling towards something almost white at the center. Beautiful. In the particular way that things were beautiful when you thought you might not see them again. He will come for the scent of my flowers. She held onto the words like a handhold. He will always know. The bird went first. A single rook exploded from the tree line below with a sharp, hollow crack of wings. Then another, then a dozen. Then the entire canopy erupted in a black churning mass that wheeled upward and scattered in every direction at once. The hunter on watch straightened, looked at the tree line, said nothing. Then the mountain trembled, not violently, not the way rockfall trembled. This was lower than that, a vibration more felt than heard, somewhere at the base of the sternum where instinct lived before thought could reach it. The card game stopped. The third hunter's hand moved to his crossbow. Magnus turned, and his face did something Hela had never seen it do in 12 years. It went slack. No, he said. Nothing else, just that one syllable, barely above a whisper, pushed through a jaw that had stopped working correctly. He took a step backward from the cliff edge, and his heel nearly went over empty air before he caught himself. Load the bolts, someone said. How did he load the bolts? Hela heard the sound half a second before they did. Not the crashing, explosive entrance she had imagined in the years of quiet planning. No war drums, no thunder, no sound of an army descending. Just a howl, singular, enormous, clean. Rolling down from somewhere above the north ridge and filling the pass so completely that for a moment there was nothing else in the world. No wind, no birds, no sound of breathing from the men surrounding her. Only that. And then he was there. He came over the ridge at a speed that didn't belong to anything moving on 2 legs. Hela's vision was compromised by then, the edges eaten away by silver and exhaustion, but she could see enough. He was large in the way her imagination had never quite captured over 12 years of quiet, stubborn planning. Not simply tall, but built the way a cliff face was built, with the dense and unhurried solidity of something that had never needed to make itself smaller to survive. Dark hair, dark coat, the jaw and the set of the shoulders of a man who had not asked permission from the world in a very long time. He hit the plateau at the base of the path and slowed to a walk so abruptly it seemed like physics disagreeing with itself. The hunters raised their weapons. He didn't look at them. His eyes moved through the plateau, past the 2 with crossbows, past the one with the silver-tipped spear, past Magnus standing pale and frozen at the cliff's edge, and found her, found the chains, found the burns spreading up her forearms like something living. and something happened behind his face that Hala had no word for. It moved through him the way current moved through water, from the outside in, then deeper, then somewhere she couldn't see. His wolf. She could feel it the way you felt pressure change before a storm, a heaviness in the air that hadn't existed a moment ago. Then that pressure detonated. Mate. She didn't hear it, but she felt it pass through the plateau like a shockwave, felt it hit him first and then radiate outward, and she watched something fracture in his expression. Watched it fracture, and then watched him lock it down with a force of will she could almost see operating behind his eyes, jaw tightening, head turning a fraction away from her, as if a few degrees of distance would be enough. It wasn't enough. His wolf wasn't waiting. The first hunter raised his crossbow and fired. Victor moved faster. What followed was not a fight in any sense the word usually carried. A fight implied duration, implied exchange. This was systematic and swift and nearly silent. One man stopped moving, then another. Then the third was briefly airborne, and then he wasn't. The crossbow shattered against the rock face. Silver weapons hit the ground. Hala pressed her spine against the cliff, kept her breathing even, and watched the Alpha King dismantle 5 trained hunters with the focused efficiency of a man who had long since stopped finding it difficult. He didn't speak, didn't snarl, didn't waste the energy on theater. He simply moved through them, and when he was finished, he was still moving. Magnus ran. He got 11 steps. Victor caught him at the edge of the plateau with one hand around the back of his neck, lifted him, and turned slowly, the way a man turned something he intended to examine carefully before deciding what to do with it. Magnus's boots left the ground. His hands clawed at the grip around his throat with the desperate mechanical urgency of a reflex that already understood it wasn't going to save him. Victor's free arm drew back. "Don't kill him." Her own voice surprised her. It came out clearly, steadier than she had any right to expect from a woman who could no longer feel her hands. Victor stopped. Every living body on that plateau stopped. The arm did not complete its motion. He turned to look at her, not with the fury she had braced for, not with impatience or dismissal, but with something rawer than any of that, something that didn't have a clean name. And in the absolute silence that followed, the understanding moved through every witness present like a cold current finding the lowest ground. The Alpha King had obeyed an Omega. Magnus hung suspended in his grip, shaking. Nobody spoke. Victor's gold eyes stayed on Hala's face, and whatever he was searching for there, or whatever he was trying not to find, she didn't yet know. But the arm stayed still. She didn't remember the journey. Later, she would piece together fragments, the sensation of being lifted, the cold air of high altitude against her face, the smell of pine and stone, and beneath all of it, something steadier and warmer that she would eventually understand belonged to him. She remembered voices she didn't recognize issuing instructions in clipped, urgent tones, firelight through closed eyelids, the particular agony of silver being drawn from a wound, which was less like pain and more like something structural being corrected against its will. Then for a long time, nothing. When she surfaced, the ceiling was rough-hewn stone fitted with iron brackets holding oil lamps, and a fire burned in a hearth cut directly into the mountain wall. The room smelled of Hala's camphor and dried herbs she couldn't immediately name, and her wrists were wrapped in something cool and dense that pulled the remaining heat from the burns with slow, methodical patience. A woman with grey-streaked hair and a healer's apron was watching her from across the room. "Back," the woman said simply, as though Hala had merely stepped out for a moment. "The journal," Hala said, "safe." The healer nodded toward the small table beside the bed. The leather cover was there, undisturbed, exactly as Hala had kept it. "You wouldn't release it even when you were barely conscious. Took 3 of us to convince your hands to let go." Hala exhaled. Then she became aware of the chair. It sat close to the right side of the bed, too close to be casual, pulled forward from wherever it normally lived to a position that left perhaps 18 inches between its occupant and the edge of the mattress. It was empty now, but the impression in the cushion was recent, and there was a cup of cold tea on the floor beside it that had never been moved toward the fire. "How long?" Hala asked. The healer's expression was carefully neutral. 2 days. He was here, not a question. The woman picked up her cloth and turned back to her supply table and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. He came back an hour later. She heard him in the corridor before the door opened. Not loudness, but the particular quality of presence that preceded him. The way the air pressure shifted very slightly. The way her wolf stirred in her chest with that low, embarrassing recognition she was rapidly losing the ability to explain away. Victor stopped in the doorway. He had removed the black coat. His sleeves were rolled to the elbows. There was a tension in the line of his jaw that suggested he had spent the last 2 days doing something that required considerable effort and no satisfaction, and when his eyes found her face, fully conscious, fully present, something in his expression shifted before he could organize it into something more controlled. "You're awake," he said. "You stayed." He moved to the chair, sat in it the way a man sat in a place he had occupied for some time, didn't answer. The healer found a reason to be elsewhere. Hayla studied him in the firelight, the scarring along his jaw that she hadn't been able to see clearly on the plateau, the way his hands rested on his knees with the contained stillness of something that was never entirely at rest. She had spent 12 years building a version of this man in her imagination, assembled from rumors and whispers and one dead woman's love for her son. The real version was quieter than she'd expected, and more tired. She reached for the journal. "This belongs to you," she said. He looked at it for a long moment before he took it, turned it over once in his hands. Something in the gesture was involuntary, the slight tightening of the fingers, the way he recognized the leather without opening it, the way recognition moved across his face like weather moving across open ground. He read through the night. Hayla didn't sleep. She watched him from the bed, while the fire burned low and the lamps guttered, and he turned pages with the focused stillness of a man who understood he was standing at the edge of something he could not uncross. Occasionally his hand stopped moving. Occasionally his jaw tightened to a degree that seemed structural. Twice he set the journal on his knee and stared into the middle distance for long, enough that she wondered if he had stopped altogether. He hadn't. Near dawn, on a page near the back, he went very still. Not the controlled stillness she had come to recognize. Something different, something that started in his hands, a fine tremor, barely visible, and moved upward. She had read that page herself. She knew what it said. "They do not know about the child yet. I have hidden it well. I am afraid, but I am not sorry. Whatever comes, Victor must never know that his sister died with me. He carries enough." The journal lowered to his knee. Victor's head dropped forward, his shoulders, those broad, fortress shoulders that had not shifted by a fraction during the slaughter on the plateau, that had carried 18 years of isolation and rage, and the particular exhaustion of a man who had survived everything by refusing to feel it. Moved once, twice. Hella said nothing. There was nothing to say that the silence wasn't already holding better. After a long time, his voice came out rough and low, as though it hadn't been used for the kind of thing it was currently being asked to do. "She never abandoned me." "No," she fought. Yes, another silence, longer. For 12 years. His head lifted, his eyes red-rimmed gold, utterly exposed in a way she suspected no living person had seen in a very long time. "Found her face. And they did this to you." His gaze dropped briefly to her wrapped wrists. "Because you tried to tell me." "Yes." The word sat between them. Then, very quietly, as though the answer genuinely might undo him. "You almost died for me?" Hella held his gaze. "No," she said. "For your mother." The Alpha King closed his eyes, and the tears that had been building for 18 years finally had somewhere to go. 12 years earlier, the moonbloom grew best in the hour after sunrise. Hella had learned this by accident. She had snuck into the Luna's private garden one morning before the pack house woke, intending only to look, and had found the pale flowers open in a way they never were by midday, their centers wide and almost luminous in the early light, as though the sun was something they greeted rather than merely endured. She had been crouched in the soil, staring at them when Luna Alira's voice came from the archway behind her. "You're the one who's been pulling the dockweed from the east bed." 9-year-old Hella scrambled to her feet, already composing an apology. The Luna raised one hand. "Don't," she said. "I've been trying to kill that weed for 2 summers. Sit down." Hela sat. Alira lowered herself onto the stone bench beside the bed and studied her with the kind of direct, unhurried attention that adults almost never gave to Omega children. She was beautiful in the particular way of someone whose beauty was entirely incidental to them, dark-haired, pale-skinned, with careful eyes that seemed to be doing quiet calculations at all times. "You know the names," the Luna said. It wasn't a question. Her gaze had moved to the way Hella's hands rested near the plants, close but not touching, the instinctive caution of someone who understood that growing things had preferences. "Only the ones for healing," Hela said carefully. Luna Alira smiled. "Sit with me tomorrow." Hela came back the next morning, and the one after that. Victor she encountered by accident, the way most things in that season of her life arrived, sideways, without announcement. He was 15, and already moving through the pack house with the compressed, forward-leaning energy of a young man who had somewhere more important to be, always, and who had not yet learned to disguise impatience as something more acceptable. He had come into the garden looking for his mother and found Hela instead, up to her wrists in soil, transferring seedlings with the focused absorption of someone who had found the one place in the pack that made sense to her. He had looked at her for a moment. "You're the Omega who pulls weeds. Your mother asked me to." Something shifted in his expression, not warmth exactly, but the recalibration of someone updating an assumption. He nodded once and left without further commentary. After that, he occasionally passed through without stopping, and occasionally stopped without saying much, and once sat on the stone bench for nearly an hour while Hela worked, and his mother wasn't home, not speaking, apparently requiring nothing except the particular quality of quiet that the garden held. She had not understood then that she was witnessing a boy practicing how to be at rest. The night it happened, she was not supposed to be in the garden. It was late autumn, the kind of cold that arrived before dark and settled in for the season, and Hela had come to cover the last of the moonbloom before the frost took it. A task that took 20 minutes, a task that nobody would have noticed or objected to. She heard them before she saw them. Magnus's voice first, low and insistent, carrying the particular cadence of a man who has made his decision and is informing rather than discussing. She went still in the shadow of the east archway, with both hands still holding the burlap covers she'd brought for the plants. Luna Elira stood at the far end of the garden near the cliffside railing. Magnus stood 3 feet from her. His posture was the posture of someone who had already completed the internal calculation and arrived at the outcome. She heard Alpha Gideon before she saw him, the side door opening, his footsteps unhurried on the stone path. He came to stand beside Magnus, 2 men. One woman at a railing above 100-foot drop. Hela pressed herself into the archway's shadow and stopped breathing. She could not hear every word. What she heard came in fragments. Gideon's voice saying evidence and counsel and cannot allow, and Magnus saying something low and flat that she couldn't make out, and then Luna Elira's voice, clear and unafraid in a way that was almost incomprehensible given the geometry of the situation. "You already know about the child. You've known for weeks. This isn't about the evidence." A silence. "Then you understand," Gideon said. "I understand everything," Elira said. "That doesn't mean I'll." Magnus moved. It was not slow. It was not hesitant. It was the motion of someone who had rehearsed it, or something worse, someone who found it easy. 1 step forward and both hands out, and Luna Elira was gone. There was no sound from below. Or perhaps there was, and Hela couldn't hear it over the sound of her own heartbeat, which had become the only thing in the world for several seconds. Magnus turned. His eyes swept the garden. Hela did not move, did not breathe. He looked directly at the archway for 3 long seconds. Then Gideon said his name quietly, and they both went back inside, and the door closed, and the garden was silent except for the wind coming up from the pass. She told the truth. That was the thing she had never stopped being certain of, even in the years that followed when certainty about everything else had become complicated. She had gone directly to the Pack Elders' Hall the following morning and told them exactly what she had seen. Every word she could remember, every detail of where each person stood and what had been said and what had been done. They had listened, and then Beta Magnus had stepped forward and explained, calmly and with evident patience for the difficulty of the situation, that young Hela had been found wandering the grounds in a confused state on the night in question, that she was known to be emotionally unstable since her parents' deaths, that the trauma of losing the Luna had clearly manifested in this fabricated account, and that the kindest response was firmness combined with compassion. Nobody disagreed. 9-year-old Hela had stood in the center of that hall and watched the truth be folded up and put away. Nobody listened to a worthless Omega. Present Victor sat with the journal closed on his knee for a long time after Hela finished. She had told it plainly, without decoration, the way she had trained herself to tell it over 12 years of private accounting, in the quiet moments when she needed to remember why she was still carrying it. He had not interrupted once. When she finished, the fire had burned to coals. "They covered it the same night," he said finally. "Not a question. By morning it was official. Hunting accident. I was a problem to be managed." His jaw moved once. "And you stayed. I had nowhere to go." He looked at her. That particular look she was becoming familiar with, the one that meant he was revising something significant, and said, "The grave." The shift in his voice made her still. "My mother's grave," he said. "The flowers on it. Fresh ones. Every time my scouts have passed through that territory." His eyes held hers. "That was you." "Yes." "For how long?" Hela held his gaze. "Every week," she said. "Since the burial." Victor said nothing. He looked at the cold hearth for a long moment, and something moved across his face that she couldn't name. Grief and something older than grief. some deep structural recognition that a person could be loyal to the dead in ways that had no audience and required no acknowledgement and cost everything. 12 years, not once missed. He bent forward and pressed his face briefly into his hands, and Hello understood, without either of them saying so, that he was not weeping for his mother this time. He was weeping for the 9-year-old girl who had stood alone in a hall full of liars, and remembered anyway. The sanctuary had a rhythm, and Hella learned it the way she learned most things, by paying attention to what nobody thought to tell her. Breakfast arrived early. The healers came mid-morning. Victor's beta, Rowan, conducted pack business in the outer corridor between the second and third lamp of the afternoon, his voice carrying through the stone wall with a carrying quality that suggested he had never once in his life seen the value of lowering it. Victor himself moved through the day in a pattern that was entirely his own and entirely consistent. Present before dawn, absent for several hours in the middle of the day, back by evening with the particular contained tiredness of a man who ran very large things and found them unsatisfying. He always came back to the chair beside her bed. He didn't announce it, didn't explain it. Simply arrived and sat with a book or a document or occasionally nothing at all, and the fire burned, and the room held the specific quality of silence that two people produce when both are pretending the silence is accidental. By the fourth day, Hayla's wrists had healed to smooth, pale scarring. By the fifth, she no longer needed the healers. By the sixth, there was no longer any medical justification for Victor's presence in the chair. He moved it 3 inches closer. Neither of them mentioned it. The protection had begun subtly enough. A word to the healers about her dietary needs that she had never shared with him. Somehow correctly identified anyway. A heavier blanket that appeared without comment after she had shivered once near the window. The morning she had attempted to walk the corridor alone and found Victor beside her within 30 seconds, not holding her arm, not making a production of it, simply present at her left shoulder with the casual attentiveness of someone who happened to be going the same direction. "I'm not going to fall," she said. "I know." He stayed at her left shoulder. On the 7th morning, 2 of the outer guards shifted their patrol route without explanation, and when Hella looked out the window she understood that the new route created a permanent perimeter around the section of the grounds she used for walking. She didn't mention it. He didn't explain it. But she caught him watching her from the upper window when she walked, and he didn't look away when their eyes met. And that was the day she understood that the chair being 3 inches closer was not an accident and had never been one. He moved the chair again, Rowan said. The beater was leaning in the doorway of the outer room with his arms crossed and the expression of a man deriving substantial enjoyment from the present situation. He was broad and dark-haired with an open, irreverent face that seemed constitutionally incapable of gravity, and he had taken an immediate and entirely unsubtle interest in the developments of the past week. Victor didn't look up from the map on the table. "Rowan, 3 inches yesterday, 4 today. My estimate is he'll be holding her hand by the new moon and absolutely refusing to discuss it. Rowan, I've known you 11 years. Your wolf has been silent for 18. You're now moving furniture toward a woman you won't acknowledge and reorganizing the entire guard rotation around her morning walk." He tilted his head. "I'm just tracking the data." Victor looked up. Rowan looked back pleasantly. "Get out." "Absolutely." He pushed off the doorway. "The chair's going to reach the bed before he admits anything. I'm telling the healers we're going to have a pool." The door closed. Victor stared at it for a moment. Then he returned to the map and did not move the chair again that day, and moved it 2 inches further the following morning. She found him on the outer ledge the night he finally talked about it. He was standing at the railing with his forearms resting on the stone, looking out at the mountain dark, and he didn't turn when she came to stand beside him, but his shoulders shifted slightly in the particular way she had learned meant he had been aware of her before she arrived. For a while, neither of them said anything. "My father left 8 months after my mother died," he said finally. "Not to her exactly, to the dark, to the mountains, with Hayla standing close enough to receive it. Pack law gave him the right. The Luna was gone. He had no further obligation." He paused. He exercised it. Hella said nothing, held the silence for whatever came next. "I was 19, the pack was already fracturing. The elders who had helped kill my mother were running it." His jaw set. "I spent 3 years building something that could take it back. What I built was not gentle." He glanced at her once. "I became king through blood. That's not mythology. It's just what happened. And your wolf?" The question cost her something to ask. She felt him feel the cost of it. "Silent," he said. "The night my mother died, he went quiet. Not gone, I could feel him breathing somewhere deep, but unreachable. He turned the words over carefully. I learned to operate without him. You do what you have to. Until the plateau, until the plateau. The mountains held the dark between them. Hela, he said, and the way he said her name was already different from how he'd said it initially. Lower, with more care, as though it had acquired weight through use. Whatever my wolf believes, you don't have to say it. I do. He turned to face her. In the lamplight from the doorway behind them, she could see exactly how much this was costing him, and exactly how little he intended to let that stop him. I don't know how to do this. Any of it. I know how to build armies. I know how to end things. I don't. He stopped, looked at his own hands on the railing briefly, then back at her. Men like me don't get mates. That's not self-pity. It's just accurate. Hela looked at him for a long moment. I'm not asking you for anything, she said quietly. I never was. And because she meant it entirely, and because he could hear that she meant it, that was somehow worse. The discovery came on the 9th day. She had been reading the journal again, cataloguing, cross-referencing the names against what she remembered of interpack politics from 12. Years of listening to conversations nobody thought Omegas tracked, the payments, the dates, the signatures from council representatives of 4 separate packs, 2 of them bordering territories that answered directly to the High Council. She brought it to Victor without ceremony, pointed to the page. He read it standing, bending over the table, one hand planted flat on the map beneath. She watched the shift happen in him, not slowly, the way understanding usually arrived, but all at once, like a structure that had been compromised in multiple places, simultaneously finally acknowledging the inevitable. He straightened. These aren't Moonfang elders. His voice had gone very quiet in the way she was learning meant the opposite of calm. His finger moved down the page. Silverfen Pack, the Ashford Council seat, the Northern Border Commission. He looked at her. These men report to the High Council. Yes, this wasn't a pack elder covering up one murder. His eyes moved back to the page. Something cold and certain was settling into his expression, replacing grief with something older and harder. Magnus didn't organize this alone. Gideon didn't organize this alone. No, the room had gone very still. Victor set the journal down. This wasn't murder, he said. His voice was quiet, completely quiet. This was treason. The preparations took 6 days. Hela watched them from the upper window, the steady, unhurried accumulation of something enormous, assembled with the precision of a man who had done this before, and found theatrics unnecessary. Wolves arrived in groups of 20 and 40 and 100, moving through the mountain passes in the grey early mornings, settling into camp formations that expanded outward from the sanctuary like rings in water. No drums, no ceremony, just the quiet, methodical business of an army that already knew what it was there to do. Victor didn't call it an army, he called it a return. The distinction mattered to him in ways he'd explained once briefly, standing over the strategy table with Rowan and 2 senior captains. We're not going to war, he said. We're going home. Rowan had looked at the assembled 2,000 wolves on the map and said nothing, which for Rowan was its own form of eloquence. There's a difference, Victor said. There's a distinction, Rowan said carefully. Whether Gideon understands the difference is another question. Victor looked at the map. Then we'll educate him. The news reached Moonfang 4 days before they did. Hela knew because the first refugee passed them on the mountain road. A young pack member, barely 17, moving north alone with a pack on his back and the wide, emptied eyes of someone who had made a calculation and acted on it before it could be reconsidered. He stopped when he saw the column, stared at Victor for a long moment. Then he stepped aside and took his hat off. By the time they reached the first Moonfang watchtower, it was already abandoned. Inside the territory, panic had apparently arranged itself into stages. First, disbelief. Reports suggested that upon receiving confirmation of Victor's advance, Gideon had thrown the messenger out of the hall and summoned 3 separate scouts to verify independently. Then scrambling, weapons pulled from storage, alliances called in, desperate messages dispatched to the 4-pack leaders whose names were in the journal. Then, when none of those messages returned with useful answers, something that wasn't quite preparation and wasn't quite surrender, but occupied the miserable territory between them. Magnus, according to their intelligence, had not left the pack house in 2 days. The pack house road was lined with people. Hela had expected fear. She had prepared for it the way she had spent 12 years preparing for the particular quality of Moonfang's contempt. What she hadn't prepared for was the silence. Not hostile silence, not the absence of sound that preceded violence. Something more complicated than that. The silence of people who had performed a revision and were still in the process of completing it. looking at her with expressions that moved between recognition and shame without quite landing on either. She had left this territory in chains, chased, bleeding. She returned beside the Alpha King, straight-spined on a grey horse, with silver scars on her wrists visible below her sleeves. A woman near the road's edge, older, someone who had once told 9-year-old Hela that a worthless Omegawa's word wasn't worth the breath it was, carried on, dropped her gaze and did not raise it again. Hela looked straight ahead. She didn't need them to look away. She just needed the truth to be heard. The evidence vault was smoking when they arrived. Someone had attempted to burn it, had gotten as far as igniting the outer records room before Victor's advanced scouts, moving faster than Gideon's people had anticipated, reached the building and contained it. 3 elders were detained attempting to leave through the eastern gate with document cases. A 4th had already cleared the territory. Victor surveyed the damage in the records room with Rowan at his shoulder and said nothing for long enough that Rowan grew visibly uncomfortable. "The journal is enough," Hela said from the doorway. "Everything in it is cross-referenced, even without the physical records, the testimony from the witnesses we've already identified." "I know," Victor said. He turned and walked out, and Hela understood, watching the set of his back as he went, that what he was containing in that moment was not merely anger. It was the particular rage of a man who had hoped, despite better judgment, that the people who murdered his mother might have something in them capable of dignity. They had tried to burn the truth, even now, even with 2,000 wolves at the gate. The assassin came that night. She had retired to the room they'd assigned her in the packhouse's east wing, a healer's room, functional and plain, which suited her, and was sitting at the small desk reading, when the window's cold air shifted in a way that had nothing to do with wind. She was on her feet before she consciously understood why. The figure came through the window, fast and quiet, with the practiced efficiency of someone hired rather than motivated, which in some ways made them more dangerous. Hela threw the desk chair and bought herself 2 seconds and used them to reach the door. She didn't reach the door. The blow hit her left shoulder and drove her into the wall, and she was sliding down the stone when the room's temperature changed entirely. Not metaphorically, but physically, the way air changed when the pressure behind a storm finally arrived, and the door came off its hinges. What came through it was not Victor containing himself. What came through it was Victor having already stopped. She had seen him on the plateau. She understood now that the plateau had been measured. Deliberate. A man in full possession of his faculties making considered decisions about how much force to apply. This was different. This had no ceiling. The assassin managed to stand, made it 3 steps toward the window. Neither made it further. When it was over, the room was very quiet, and Victor was crouched in front of her where she had pressed herself against the wall, one hand on her face, checking, with shaking hands that had just demonstrated they were capable of things she would not catalogue, and his voice when it came was barely sound at all. "Where?" he said. "Shoulder," she said. "Victor, where else?" Outside the door, in the corridor, she could hear Rowan and the captains, and beyond them, further, the compound in total silence. 2,000 wolves who had followed a king into enemy territory without hesitation, and every single one of them had just remembered why. Victor could have taken the packhouse by force in under an hour. Gideon knew this. Magnus knew this. Every elder who had locked themselves into the inner hall the night of the assassin attempt knew this, and the knowing had done something to their faces that Hela noticed the following morning when Victor summoned them to the main yard, a kind of comprehensive reduction, as though the careful architecture of authority they had maintained for 18 years had been a structure built on a single load-bearing wall, and the wall had just been identified. Victor stood in the yard with his hands behind his back and delivered his terms in a voice that was entirely conversational. "A public trial," he said, 3 days from now. "Full territorial attendance. Every pack member in Moonfang territory who can travel. Evidence presented openly." He looked at each elder in sequence with the unhurried attentiveness of a man checking items from a list. "No war. No executions without due process." He paused. "You'll want to take the offer." Gideon, who had not achieved his position through stupidity, looked at the 2,000 wolves distributed through his compound and took the offer. They came from everywhere. 3 days was not much time to summon a territory, but the news had already been moving for a week, spreading through Moonfang's holdings and beyond into neighboring packs with the particular velocity that only truth, long suppressed, could generate. By the morning of the trial, the valley below Blackstone Pass held more wolves than Hela had ever seen assembled in one place. Not hundreds, but thousands, filling the tiered slope that faced the old judgment platform in a massive stillness that had its own specific weight. Rowan, standing at Hella's shoulder while the platform was prepared, surveyed the valley with the expression of someone recalibrating. "More than we estimated," he said. "They've been waiting," Hella said. He glanced at her. "For 18 years, for someone to say it out loud." The platform itself was Moonfang's traditional trial ground, a raised stone tier used for pack judgments, large enough to be visible from the full slope, with the cliff face of Blackstone Pass rising behind it. Someone had thought to bring torches even in daylight, and they burned along the platform's edge in the early morning wind with a formality that felt, for once, earned. Victor opened the proceedings without preamble. He stood at the platform's center and let the silence extend until it was complete, until the valley had gone fully quiet, until even the wind seemed to understand it was supposed to hold. And then he spoke in a voice that carried the kind of distance only certainty produced. 18 years ago, Lunar Illyra of Moonfang Pack was murdered. Nothing moved in the valley. The official record states otherwise. Today, the official record will be corrected. He nodded to Rowan, who stepped forward with the journal. The evidence took the better part of the morning. Victor's appointed archivist, a composed, grey-haired woman from his own territory, who had spent 30 years processing pack law, read each relevant entry aloud in chronological order, pausing after each to identify the corresponding witness or document corroboration. Names, dates, payment records. The cross-referenced testimonies of 4 wolves who had been junior hunters the night of Illyra's death, and who had, upon learning that 2,000 soldiers were in the valley, independently decided that their prior silence had run its natural course. The first elder broke during the payment records. He was not the one Hella would have predicted, a quiet, administrative man named Soren who had always seemed more interested in logistics than politics. He stood abruptly from the accused's bench, and before his legal counsel could intervene, delivered a full accounting of the arrangement, including amounts received, from whom, and for what purpose. The valley absorbed this without eruption, quietly, the way something long known becomes something finally said. The second elder broke 20 minutes later. The third said nothing but stopped denying. The unborn daughter was disclosed just before midday. The archivist read the entry plainly, without inflection, which was the only appropriate way to read it. Illyra's words in her own hand, recorded 6 weeks before her death, describing the pregnancy and the specific reason it made her situation more dangerous, that Gideon had no legitimate heir, and a second child from his predecessor's line would have complicated the succession he had spent 3 years quietly organizing. The valley was silent for a very long time after that particular entry. Gideon himself, seated at the accused's bench with the careful composure of a man who had decided that composure was his only remaining asset, looked at the ground for a moment, then looked up, and in his expression, Hela saw something she had not expected to see and could not find any satisfaction in. He had known. Of course he had known. He had organized it knowing. Victor stood with his back to the accused bench and his face forward, toward the valley, and she was one of the few people positioned to see his jaw. She watched him hold the information still within himself the way a man holds a live thing that would destroy everything if he let it move. He held it. Magnus confessed at the 3rd hour. He had been seated apart from the other accused, which had been Victor's silent instruction, and which everyone had understood without explanation. When the archivist reached the entry that corresponded to the night of Illyra's death, the entry in which Illyra had written, in the careful shorthand of a woman who suspected she was recording something for the last time, a description of the argument she expected, and the people she expected to have it with. Magnus looked up from the ground he had been studying since the proceedings began. He looked at Victor. Victor didn't look back, and perhaps it was that, the complete unwavering absence of Victor's attention, the sense of a judgment already rendered and requiring no further input from the man being judged, that produced what followed. Magnus stood. His counsel reached for his arm. He shook it off. "I pushed her," he said. The valley didn't react. It had already known. Gideon said it had to be done. The counsel agreed. He stopped, started again. "I pushed her." He sat back down. His hands were shaking. Not with remorse, Hela noted, with the particular tremor of a man who has been afraid for a very long time and has simply run out of the energy required to conceal it. He wasn't confessing because he felt it. He was confessing because Victor was 10 feet away, and the alternative was finishing the next 18 years with that fact unresolved. When they called Hela to testify, the valley waited. She walked to the platform's center and turned to face the slope and thought, briefly, of a 9-year-old girl standing in a hall full of men who had already decided, before she opened her mouth, what the truth was worth. She spoke for 12 minutes. When she finished, the archivist confirmed point by point the corroboration between her testimony and the journals. Contents: 17 specific details, 17 direct alignments. Nobody called her a liar. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the sound of a verdict the valley had carried, unspoken for 18 years, finally being set down. The formal declaration came at sundown. It was delivered by the territorial elder, the most senior remaining Moonfang authority whose name did not appear in the journal, a narrow, precise man who had clearly made his political calculations before dawn and arrived at the only viable position. He stood at the platform's edge and read the declaration in full, and it said what it said. And what it said was that the succession of Alpha Gideon was hereby nullified, that the Elder Council of Moonfang Pack formally recognized the rightful claim of Victor Dawnmere as Alpha King of Moonfang and all northern territories, and that the falsified record of Luna Illyra's death was corrected, effective immediately, to reflect the truth. Gideon was taken from the platform in silence. Magnus didn't look up. Victor stood at the platform's center and let the valley witness it, and said nothing. And the torches burned along the edge in the evening wind, and somewhere below, thousands of wolves who had waited a very long time for the word began to make it. The victory had a morning after. Hayla had not anticipated this, or rather she had anticipated the mechanics of it without understanding the texture. The formal proceedings concluded. The declarations were recorded. Gideon and Magnus entered custody. The territorial elder issued the necessary documentation with the anxious efficiency of a man eager to demonstrate cooperation. And then the apparatus of justice, having completed its function, went quiet, and Victor was still grieving. She found him the morning after the trial, sitting at the strategy table in the Packhouse's war room, with no maps in front of him and no documents and nothing to indicate any purpose except the specific kind of stillness that meant a man was somewhere else entirely. Rowan had apparently already attempted conversation and withdrawn. She passed him in the corridor with an expression she had come to recognize as his version of concern, which looked almost identical to his version of amusement, but occupied the eyes differently. "He's been in there since before the dawn lamp," Rowan said. Hela nodded. "He does this," Rowan said, then paused, as though reconsidering whether that was complete. "He's always done this, after anything large. He goes somewhere inside himself, and the rest of us wait." He looked at her with the directness he usually reserved for things he considered worth the effort. "But that was before you. I don't actually know what happens now." He stepped aside. She went in. She didn't speak immediately. Came to the table and sat across from him and let the room hold them both for a while. The way she had learned to let rooms hold things in the garden 12 years ago, when a 15-year-old boy had sat in silence on a stone bench and needed nothing except not to be alone in it. Victor looked up eventually. "The grave," he said. "I haven't been. I know. I've been in this territory 4 days. I know." He held her gaze with the particular quality of a man who finds against his judgment that a specific person makes honesty easier than he intends it to be. "I don't know how to." He stopped. "You don't have to know how," Hayla said. "You just have to go." He was quiet for a moment. "Will you come?" The grave was on the eastern slope above the packhouse and below the tree line, in a small clearing that received morning sun for approximately 3 hours before the ridgeline interrupted it. Whoever had chosen the location had understood something about Illyra, that she had preferred the early light, that she had grown things that needed it, that she had been a woman of mornings rather than evenings. The moon bloom was fresh. Hayla had sent someone the day before, quietly, and they had replaced the flowers without being asked for an explanation, which was the advantage of being the woman beside the Alpha King. People tended to assume your quiet requests had structural importance. Victor stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at the stone for a long time before he moved toward it. He crouched down when he reached it, one hand on the stone's face, reading the carved lettering with his fingers the way blind men read, not because he needed to, but because touch was a different kind of knowing, and he was collecting every kind available to him. Hayla stood back. Some distances were not hers to close. She watched him stay there for a long time, his broad back curved forward, his head low, and she understood that what was happening was not only grief, but something more structural. A man setting down 18 years of a particular kind, of weight, the weight of things unfinished and unwitnessed and unspoken, the accumulated cost of surviving everything by feeling nothing. When he finally stood, his face was composed but not closed. There was a difference she had learned. Closed was the armor. Composed for him was what lay beneath it, the actual face of a man who had decided to be present. He turned to her. "I spent 18 years building toward this," he said. "The truth, the justice, bringing it back." He looked at the grave once more, then at her. "I thought when it was done I would feel finished. And I feel like I've only just started." He said it with something close to bewilderment, the specific surprise of a man discovering that the map he had been navigating with was not the territory. "I don't know what that means." Hayla did. "It means you've been surviving," she said quietly, "for 18 years. And surviving and living are not the same thing, but you can only discover the difference from the other side of it." He looked at her in the direct, unguarded way he had gradually stopped trying to avoid. "You gave it back to me," he said. "All of it." He paused, and she could see the precision with which he was choosing, rejecting and re-choosing words, not because he was uncertain of what he felt, but because he understood that what he was about to say was irreversible, and he wanted it to be exact. "My mother, her truth, this place." He gestured marginally at the clearing, the pack house below, the mountains. "I came back here as a king. I would have come, handled it, and left. I would have left." His jaw shifted. "I wouldn't have stayed." "I know," Hayla said. "I would have missed it." His voice dropped. "I would have gotten justice and gone back to surviving and not understood what I'd missed." He looked at her with the gold eyes that had first found her on the plateau through smoke and distance, and locked with a recognition neither of them had been prepared for. "The moment I smelled your blood, Hayla, I stopped being alone. I didn't choose it. I didn't want it, God knows." The ghost of something moved across his expression, something that in another man might have become a smile, and in Victor became a particular quality of light. But my wolf was right. The clearing was very quiet. "Victor, I know what I am," he said, and there was no self-pity in it, only precision. "I know what I've built myself into. I know there are things I've done that don't simplify." He held her gaze. "I'm not asking you to pretend otherwise." He lowered himself to one knee on the ground in front of his mother's grave, not with ceremony, not with the performative deliberateness of a man staging a moment. He simply went down, as though it was the most natural downward motion available to him, and looked up at her from that position, with the face of a man who had spent 18 years being a king and was, for this specific moment, only a person. "I'm asking you," he said, "to become my Luna." His voice was steady. His hands, she noticed, were not entirely. Not because of the bond, not because my wolf has no patience and no subtlety. Something moved in his expression, all the way through this time, uncontrolled, unretracted. "Because you stood alone in a hall full of liars when you were 9 years old and told the truth anyway. Because you tended a grave for 12 years with no audience. Because you walked into silver chains for a woman you'd already lost and a man you'd never met." He paused. "Because I don't want to go back to surviving." The morning light held them both. Hella looked down at him for a long moment, at this enormous, scarred, complicated man, kneeling in the soil of his mother's grave with the same careful honesty he had given everything since the night she put the journal in his hands. She crouched down so they were level, close enough that she could see the exact quality of the fear in his expression. Not the fear of rejection, she realized, but something more specific. The fear of being given the thing he'd stopped believing he was allowed to want. "Yes," she said. His exhale was quiet and complete, the way a structure sounds when the last piece of tension is finally removed. He pressed his forehead against hers. Behind them, the moon bloom moved in the morning wind, and Luna Elira's grave held the sun for its allotted 3 hours as it always had. 3 months changed the shape of things. Not all things. The mountains remained exactly as they had always been, indifferent, enormous, present in the particular way that geological time made everything else feel provisional. Blackstone Pass still cut through the northern ridgeline like an old scar. The cliff face still held the iron pegs where they had bolted the chains, though someone had removed the pegs in the first week and filled the holes with fresh mortar, and if you didn't know where to look, you would not find them. Hella knew where to look. She had not gone back to look. Some things deserved to be left as memory rather than revisited as geography, and she had made her peace with the cliff the way she had made her peace with most of the architecture of her life before. Not by forgetting it, but by understanding that it had brought her somewhere, and that somewhere was worth the cost of the road. The pack house had been restructured. The elders whose names appeared in the journal had been tried in the weeks following the public trial. 3 territorial proceedings, each documented, each attended by representatives from the packs whose council seats had been implicated. The process had not been swift. Victor had made it deliberate, hurried, visible, every step recorded, every sentence rendered in public. Justice that happens in private, he had said, is just another name for what they did. Gideon had been stripped of his title and exiled to the southern unmapped territories, which were not technically a punishment in law, but were a punishment in practice. Magnus was in a territorial holding facility awaiting transfer to the High Council's jurisdiction, which was its own lengthy and complicated process, involving 4 packs and several months of correspondence that Rowan handled with the grim efficiency of a man who found administrative complexity personally offensive. The 4 border packs whose signatures appeared in the journal were in various stages of their own internal reckonings. The High Council had issued a formal statement expressing grave concern and establishing a review committee, which was the institutional equivalent of clearing one's throat. But it was a beginning. Victor seemed to understand that beginnings were what they had, and that beginnings were enough if you were patient and precise and kept the evidence well organized. Hayla had spent 3 months learning what it meant to become a Luna. It was not what she had expected, or rather, she had not expected to be good at, and she was discovering she was. Not in the ceremonial sense, though she was learning that too, but in the original sense of the word, the old sense, the sense that Illyra had inhabited before anyone had killed her for it. The pack's healer, the one who paid attention, the one who knew which elder was worried about his daughter's fever, and which young enforcer was not sleeping, and which family in the outer territory hadn't been asked if they needed anything in too long. She had been doing all of this for years. Now she was simply allowed to. The full moon of late autumn fell on a Thursday. The valley held thousands. They had come from every pack in the northern territories, not summoned by command, but by the particular gravitational pull of a thing that didn't happen often, a thing that people understood instinctively was worth witnessing. Packmates and strangers and wolves from the border territories who had spent 18 years knowing something was wrong with the north and not being able to name it. They filled the tiered slope in the cold, clear dark with the torches burning along the platform's edge, and the moon overhead so full and close it seemed structural, like something load-bearing in the sky. Hayla stood at the platform's edge and looked out at them and thought, briefly and without self-importance, of how small she had been made to feel in this territory. She did not feel small now. Victor came to stand beside her, and the valley below registered his arrival the way large bodies of water registered disturbance. A ripple of awareness that moved outward from the platform in a slow expanding ring. He wore no armor, dark clothing, a grey cloak against the autumn cold, nothing ceremonial except the deliberateness of how he carried himself, which had always been ceremony enough. He looked at her once before he turned to face the valley. She nodded. He turned. The silence that preceded his voice was the silence of thousands of people simultaneously deciding to hold still. 18 years ago, Victor said, they took my mother. His voice crossed the valley without effort, not because he projected it, but because the valley was listening and silence carries. They took her, and they buried the truth with her, and they slept well in the years that followed because nobody was coming. He paused. They were certain of that. Nobody was coming because they had made certain that nobody knew. Another pause, shorter. They had one failure. He turned partially toward Hayla. They forgot about her. The valley was completely still. She was 9 years old when she watched them do it. She was 9 years old when she stood in a hall and told the truth to men who had already decided what the truth was worth. His jaw set briefly. She carried it for 12 years. Alone. Without acknowledgement, without protection, without any reason to believe that carrying it would ever matter. The torches moved in the wind. When they finally caught her, when they finally ran out of patience and came for her, she did not run. He looked at Hela fully now, turned all the way toward her, letting the valley witness the direction of his attention. She let them chain her. Something moved through the gathered wolves below, not sound but its precursor, the held breath of thousands. They chained her, he said. They burned her. His voice dropped a fraction and became somehow more present for it, and the moment silver touched her skin, he paused, and for the first time in that speech, something happened to his expression that was not gravity. I came. He reached for her wrists, not to display them, not with the performative solemnity of a man making a point to an audience. He turned her right wrist upward in his hands, the way you turn something precious, with attention to fragility and value simultaneously, and looked at the silver scarring for a moment that was entirely private despite the thousands of people present. Then he bent his head and pressed his lips to the scars, not with sorrow. That was the thing Hela understood in that moment, the thing that moved through her in a warm, structural wave from the center outward. reaching her hands and her throat and somewhere behind her eyes. He was not apologizing. He was not expressing regret for what she had endured or asking forgiveness for the world's violence on her behalf. He was grateful for the scars, for the chains, for the silver and the cliff and the 12 years and all of the cost of the road that had brought them to this specific moment, this platform, this valley full of witnesses. His teeth grazed the inside of her wrist, gentle, deliberate, the mark. The mate bond didn't arrive gradually. It arrived the way the howl had arrived on the plateau 3 months ago, complete, enormous, filling the available space so entirely that the absence preceding it became immediately incomprehensible. It moved through Hela from the point of contact outward, and then back inward and then simply settled, like something that had always been there and had only now been given its correct name. Victor raised his head. His gold eyes in the torchlight held the specific expression of a man who has been given back something he had stopped expecting to deserve. Below them the valley opened. Thousands of wolves, one voice, built from thousands. The howl moved up through the mountain passes and out across the northern territories, and kept going, the way truth moved when it was finally allowed to. Past the borders that had tried to contain it, past the years that had tried to outlast it, past the cliff face and the iron holes, and the men who had believed that enough silence could make something cease to have been. It couldn't. She had known that since she was 9 years old. She had willingly worn chains, and the truth, long buried, had finally been set free. And somewhere in the years of tending a grave and carrying a scent and choosing, when every survival instinct screamed otherwise, to remember, she had brought an Alpha King home. If you enjoyed the story, let me know in the comments. Your voice decides what I write next. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more moonlit love stories like this one.